Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. This is my review of the new release of The Flash, which of course hit theaters and the fan community very quickly developed opinions about, and it has not been doing as well as expected at the box office in terms of the opening weekend expectations. There's a lot to try and unpack and discuss, so this will slightly get into spoiler territory for those who haven't seen it, because a lot of this stuff already hit the internet long before the film came out. So I had heard some rumblings, even though I've tried to avoid things, so I kind of had the general idea of what they were doing with this film. I'd also like to preface this review that I'm not a fan of the modern Warner attempts at turning the DC Comics characters into films, and in terms of this DC cinematic universe, or whatever title they want to slap on it, I pretty much checked out after sitting through Man of Steel, because I hated what that film did to Superman, and I had no desire to sit through any more of them. I've seen some of them and bits and pieces, and after that point, and I've of course kept up with the production, because the productions themselves are fascinating, especially as someone who's put a lot of research and study into the original series of Batman films and Superman films, and to see where things are going. So I find their productions more fascinating than the films themselves, which I find quite terrible. But again, that's simply my own opinion, so you know where I'm coming from, and the fact that I was really only going to this film, and they had my money, because they were, of course, bringing back Michael Keaton. And the idea is, of course, doing another version of the Flashpoint story arc, which was done back in, I think, about 2011, and it was sort of a way to jump over into the DC's New 52 continuity. It was sort of designed in that similar way that this film is being used, to sort of transition out of the current DC continuity and jump into something new for the Warner Brothers films, and to try and once again take another bite at the apple that Marvel created of having a cinematic universe that Warner seems completely inept at trying to replicate and understand how this stuff works, especially since they kind of missed the boat for several decades of not getting any of these characters together, and the fact that there was no Justice League film, decades before Marvel even started their cinematic universe, and the fact that we never got a Batman and Superman film with Keaton and Christopher Reeve is still one of the great missed opportunities. But in any case, the announcement that Keaton was returning is sort of the carrot that's been dangled in front of us, older fans, or fans of older or previous iterations of Batman, who have no interest in the new Flash film. And on top of that, you have, again, those of us who don't really care for these modern films. And then you have all of the real-life situation regarding its star, Ezra Miller. And that has also negatively impacted the film's box office, of course. And it's something that's going to be in the back of your head, whether you're fully cognizant of all the various cases and accusations and things that have piled up in the past year or so with this person. So it's something that it is going to pop up in your head as you're watching the film. It is increasingly difficult to try and not think of that stuff if you know quite a bit about it, but that has also severely harmed the film's marketing, which is, of course, another reason why it has turned up with much less than expected box office results. So to talk about the film itself, we again have a rather bloated runtime of around 2.5 hours, which is entirely too long, but it also gets into what I think is quite a lot of the film's problem, because The Flash has never had a standalone feature film, and particularly not in this iteration. But instead of taking the time to do a standalone Flash film, they've shoved it into doing a version of Flashpoint. And so this, again, was designed to try and transition out of the current DC continuity and try to come up with something new and fit into the emerging new DC cinematic continuity at Warner Brothers. But it's also gone through several regime changes at the Warner company itself, which of course resulted in the 3 different endings that were shot. And with COVID interrupting the whole production and delaying the release once the film was ultimately finished, this is a film where essentially the pandemic did affect the overall production, and this also meant that it went through through several different regime changes at Warner that all seem to have a different idea of what this film is. So it's not just an example of having too many cooks in the kitchen in terms of the production. You have too many studio chiefs trying to fit this film into their overall view of what they want the company to be and where they want the DC branch to go. So that did not help matters. But I think that the biggest problem from a story standpoint is that you're trying to cram in a Flash-centric story into Flashpoint, which of course revolves around Flash, but you have all these other characters and the nature of the story itself in terms of time traveling and seeing all these different reflections of how characters appear in the multiverse and alternate timelines. But it draws focus away from your main character, which is a problem with some of the adaptations of Flashpoint. But trying to do this and not having a pre-existing Flash film means in order to get some of that stuff in, you're going to have a longer runtime, and that's when you're going to start running into the bloatedness. And to be honest, this film really works best and really has its most energy when it's not doing the set pieces, when it's stopping whatever it's doing and focusing on the human characters, which is why we're all here in the first place. This is the same problem with all of the modern Warner DC films, and the fact that the first Wonder Woman film had the most of this is, I think, why most people agree that is the most effective in a lot of ways, because there were more moments of actual human interaction, and those are here in the Flash the most character-centric, the most emotionally charged, and the most resonating. These are actually going to be the things you remember more than the endless set pieces that do drag on. And to be honest, while the fight choreography itself isn't bad, it's also done in the very modern, very fast-cutting way, so it is a little hard to follow things sometimes. But the chief complaint among many audience goers, because it is so glaringly obvious, is that the CG effects work throughout this film entirely is quite poor. I mean, I wouldn't even. That's being polite. It is quite terrible. It has a very, I hate to use the term cartoony in a negative light, but that's the sort of impact it has. It's been debated that perhaps this was intentional to try and convey the difference of seeing things when the Flash enters the Speed Force, but throughout the effects are so poor that it does detract from the sequences, and I found it actually frequently impossible to fully engage with the sequences going on because the effects work was so poor, and this has been a common complaint even among regular audience goers. So it's something you're going to hear from a lot of people, and even people who admit they don't often notice or get distracted by really poor effects work. So I don't know if it was a symptom of the production being sort of stymied by the pandemic and going through all these changes at Warner, or if it was a cost-cutting measure, or if they were trying to hurry up and just finally finish the film and get it out for this release date, or what have you. But the effects work is noticeably poor throughout the entire film, which does detract significantly from the experience. Some moments do work better than others, but when the entire opening has hideous CGI throughout, it does absolutely detract from the overall experience of trying to watch the Flash save a bunch of people from a burning, collapsing hospital building when they all look like you have that cartoon Uncanny Valley sort of effect. And that Uncanny Valley effect rears its ugly head at its greatest when we get to the sort of finale where we see the glimpses of other multiverses. This is very much not well or not at all kept secret about the film, that we do see glimpses of other iterations of DC characters. And this is where you get into territory of, I think the best way to put it is, just because you have the rights to or get the approval to use likenesses of actors or performers no longer with us doesn't always necessarily mean you should. So we do see some slight glimpses of other characters. So we do see an image of George Reeves as Superman. We see a quick flash of Adam West Batman. And of course, the big notable one is we do see Christopher Reeves Superman along with Helen Slater's Supergirl. And the effects are also quite poor, so you definitely have that Uncanny Valley sense, and it makes sense why they did this, and it's not necessarily there's been a lot of sort of backlash that this was not a good idea and could be considered insensitive, which I understand. However, it is a very brief instance, and it is done in really in the manner that you see done in comics a lot, where they want to pay tribute to various people, and occasionally they'll use their likenesses in a sort of flashback panel or something. So it's not out of the realm of what you might see pop up in comics when they want to reference a very iconic version of something. And it's also very quick, but you kind of know this is coming, and you kind of start squirming in your seat a bit because you're like, oh no, and then of course it's there, and the effects are so bad that it's really the effects being bad that make it so icky, because again, you get the idea, it's very quick, there's no dialogue, so at least they don't try anything like that, but it will make you as a longtime fan just sort of squirm a little bit, and the fact that the effects are so poor, it does not look good, and it's like, why would somebody rubber stamp this and say this was okay? Because it looks really bad. So I would tell people, definitely prepare yourself for that, but it's not really a secret because it's all over the internet and was really before the film came out. The other is that we do see a sort of Easter egg, which the film does have a number of those scattered throughout, of one of the multiverses containing the Nicolas Cage Superman from the canceled Superman Lives film, and he's fighting a giant spider, which of course ties into the legendary anecdote about producer John Peters always wanted to have a giant spider in a film. Again, with very poor effects, so it looks very dodgy. We do see a Nicolas Cage Superman, and it looks like they tried to replicate the infamous Polaroid where they had a test costume. So they literally tried to copy that too, with the chest hair poking out and the 90s mullet and everything. So it's definitely bizarre to see that on the big screen in some sort of iteration. And it was a nice touch. It was very appreciated. And to be honest, it would have been fine had we just seen that and some other versions, and not gone for the obvious and the slightly ickiness of using likenesses of people no longer with us. However, again, I get it. I understand why they did it. It's very quick. It doesn't go into, I think, insensitive territory. I think the insensitive part is using very poor effects to try and approximate this stuff. So nobody looks right. And apparently Nicolas Cage did. I'm not sure if that's entirely CG or not. I think it seems to be he may have actually gone and shot footage for that cameo. And if so, the effects are so bad it makes it look just as bad as the rest of the sequence that was all poor CG. So that's where the bad effects rear their head the most. And that's where the moment where a lot of fans have sort of questioned the logic of doing that. And again, I get it. It's probably not something I would necessarily do, but in terms of the story, it's okay. It makes sense why it's there. It's very quick, but it's also focusing almost entirely on other characters. In terms of, this is supposed to be a Flash movie, and we see one glimpse of seemingly the golden age Jay Garrick Flash. And that's the only other alternate Flash we really see in terms of the other multiverses. It's all versions of Batman and Superman. So again, that's a problem when your Flash movie is primarily focused on other characters. And this goes back to why I think the film's scripting it's kind of broken, in terms of it constantly stops itself to do some expository dialogue, which of course you're going to run into, especially with a 2.5 hour long movie. But it's like the movie has to constantly stop itself to advance the character arc a little bit forward, because it's like, oh yeah, this is the point where our lead character has to do this, because we're at the point of the rising action of the second act. So we got to stop here because we haven't done that already. So let's all just get all this done right here in this one little scene, and then we'll start moving again. And that's why I think it feels kind of disjointed. Also, you basically go in and you're sitting there waiting for Michael Keaton's appearance. The opening act does have Ben Affleck in his Bruce Wayne Batman iteration for a short period, but he's so underutilized that, I mean, it's really more of just a token cameo. He gets one action sequence, which, due to the bad effects, it doesn't really do anything for me. Although we do get to see a glimpse of a trying to be slightly realistic blue and gray Batman outfit. So harkening back to the classic blue and gray Batman costume from older comics. And Wonder Woman gets a very brief 2-second cameo at the end of that sequence. But honestly, it's his slightly later scene with Barry Allen's Flash, which is just a simple short dialogue scene where Affleck gets, a couple lines, which is so much more effective. And again, getting back to my point of this film is that it's most effective when it focuses on characters and stops going all over the place, because the script is very much dragged around in a lot of different directions because it has a complete lack of focus. And so again, the most resonant moments are always going to be the introspective character scenes. And of course, Barry Allen decides, because this is actually also a version of Flashpoint, to go back in time to try and prevent the death of his mother. Interestingly, they do play around with Flashpoint a little bit. There are significant differences from the original comic, from the animated film adaptation, and from the television version in the Flash series, which I have not seen, but I have read some about, and I know they did a rather highly regarded version of their own. But this also means we've now seen this story, 3 times previously in the not too distant past. They do try and massage the story elements a little bit, where Barry is trying to not mess with time all that much, but just the little change in a very classical science fiction style upsets the entire balance of the timeline. And then that's when we essentially get thrown into the sort of a second act where Barry meets his younger self, who is completely a different characterization. And then we have the dual Barrys encounter Michael Keaton's Batman. The interesting thing here is, of course, Keaton's performance is the best thing in the film. There's no getting around that. All the performances in the film are solid and well done. I didn't have a problem with any of the performances. It's the script I have a problem with, along with the tone and the direction throughout, not to mention the terrible effects. But it's what they give Keaton's Bruce Wayne to do, and they do the whole, oh, well, Bruce Wayne's been a recluse all these years, and he shows up, with the Robinson Crusoe hair and beard, but it's like Wayne Manor's fallen apart, and they've tried to recreate a lot of the 89 film Wayne Manor isms in terms of the armory room and the library and stuff. So I guess Batman Returns never happened in this universe, but it just doesn't fit right in terms of how I think we all view the Keaton Bruce Wayne persona. And you have the trappings of 89, and you have Keaton's committed performance, and in terms of his performance, it's like no time has passed at all. He's just there, and there is no sense of, I'm having to figure out how to do this again. In some ways, it's how we feel when we see Harrison Ford in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. That is not a problem with that terribly poor experience of a film. In terms of one of the only things that's not wrong with that film is that Harrison Ford's performance is so committed and so total as Indy that it feels like no time has passed at all in terms of the performance and characterization, in terms of relationship between actor and role. That's what we have here with Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne, and in the Batsuit, which is very much harkening back to replicating the 1989 design with some elements of the Returns costume. So in terms of the visuals, Batman himself seems very much grounded in the Burton films. So again, it's what they give Keaton's Bruce to do in terms of the story setup, and he's just apparently been sitting around Wayne Manor for a couple decades now because Gotham is supposedly a clean city, but I think that's taking the whole Dark Knight Returns aspect of a broken Bruce, or I guess technically more it would be a Batman Beyond type approach of a broken Bruce Wayne, not doing anything for a while. I've never quite liked that idea, because when you look at Bruce Wayne, he would not. That's not how he's wired. Essentially, that he can't stop fighting crime and being the world's greatest detective, whether he can physically be Batman or not. It's not something you easily give up. It's not a winnable crusade, essentially. But that's the setup for Keaton's Batman, and then essentially he is cajoled into helping the two Barry Allens try and set right the timeline, because this film ties into Man of Steel by having General Zod land again and start trying to destroy the Earth. And we have our new unlikely group of heroes have to go after and ostensibly seem to rescue Superman, which is what they do in the Flashpoint comic. And so you see here a direct parallel with, okay, now we're the essentially the Flashpoint story arc in terms of the original comic and how it's done. It's still the foundation. It's the spine of the story here. So while all the trappings are different, and we no longer have the alternate universe Thomas Wayne Batman, we now have Michael Keaton's Batman substituted in. The spine of the story is different. So here again, it's essentially redoing the whole villain and plot of Man of Steel instead of the war between the Atlanteans and the Themyscirans from the Flashpoint story. So if you've ever had any experience with Flashpoint, or you've read it, or you've seen the previous adaptations, this is not going to be a surprise for you. I mean, I think we all kind of knew that going in, but it doesn't really bring anything new to the table. And the fact that we're essentially seeing Man of Steel from an alternate angle, as you have in most time travel stories, it doesn't have the gravitas of the original Flashpoint story in terms of, yes, the whole world is at stake, but we've seen this before. And the film doesn't really get you invested in the attempt at trying to stop this. It's more about, oh, well, this is all because Barry did a stupid and selfish thing, and now he has to try and fix it. And you are disconnected from the whole world being at stake, essentially. So it's just it should be more effective, and I think it all comes down to the fact that the film just doesn't have a good deal of focus. Another problem that I think is just as big as the focus issue is the constant undercutting of its own tone. The film does try to win over audiences throughout. There is a good deal of humor, and there is some levity, which kind of goes part and parcel with the Flash. The Flash is a lighter character. The Flash is primarily rooted in science fiction and is known for his jokier tone. So that is, of course, more befitting a Flash film. But again, this is not a standalone Flash film. This is a Flash film shoved into a Flashpoint adaptation with all these other characters, and it's consistently, rather grim and dark throughout. So the constant humor, while it does make the audience chuckle, every time this pops up, the film is essentially shooting itself in its own foot. It's pulling the rug out from under itself. That's not to say you don't need humor, because you absolutely do, and that's one of the biggest problems with all of these films of this era. But to do this in this way, it's never intelligent humor. It's always cheap humor. It's always done at the expense of the scene. It's always a cheap gag or a cheap laugh, and or a pointless random reference that makes the film longer and detracts from the pacing. So it was rather distracting, and it was consistently done throughout. So I don't know why they thought that was a better approach than trying to fold in the humor naturally. And that's not to say that it's not delivered well. It's delivered just fine, but it's in terms of how the humor's designed. Every time it is used, it stops the movie cold. And while, you might get a chuckle here and there, it really undercuts the tone severely throughout. So then basically the film has to start building its tone back up, and then there's another rug pull. They even do that with the title card of the film at the start, where we start to get the Flash title card, and then, nope, stop, got to have a dumb joke, and then start again, and then get the title card for the opening sequence. So you kind of know what you're in for at the start of it. But I was just very surprised to see that so prevalent and consistent throughout, that the film just basically undercuts itself at every opportunity, it seems. So again, there is stuff to like here, but I think ultimately, as Keaton's Bruce says in the film when he's discussing the timelines, because of course they give Bruce Wayne all the dialogue trying to explain what's going on, which yes, Bruce Wayne is the world's greatest detective. Yes, he would have some knowledge of time travel and multiverses and things, but it just feels really lazy and sudden to just have him giving all this expository dialogue while they're just standing in his kitchen and they just met him 30 seconds ago, and Bruce has to deal with two Barry Allens from universes that he has had no conception of, and again, he's got the Robinson Crusoe beard, and then he just has to give this whole monologue about don't mess with time streams. It's like, okay, yes, that's understandable, but it feels like lazy writing because it's just suddenly there, and it's just totally expository. So yeah, that could have been done better. But in that speech, he literally says that if you mess with these things, eventually you just have a hot mess. This film is a hot mess. It's not quote unquote bad. It will and has seemed to generally please most audiences. And I think having that consistent humor throughout does help win people over, in addition to the nostalgia overload of actually seeing Michael Keaton's Batman moving around and having action set pieces and things and interacting in a film again for the first time since 1992. However, it's not a film that's going to stay with you. It's not a film that you're going to think of a lot of things afterwards. It just kind of, you can watch it once and you get everything and you don't really need to return to it. And while it's nice having Michael Keaton's Batman on the screen again and all the performances are good, again, it just doesn't add up to anything. And when the film ends on another, I mean, it's not a dumb joke, but it's a sort of, okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. And again, that ending was shot 3 different ways with 3 different endings due to different studio regimes. So it closes the film, I think, on the most fitting note. I think it is the best ending of those 3 in terms of who shows up. It just has an air of emptiness and sort of flatness, and then the last shot is literally another dumb, very on the nose joke that undercuts the tone once again. That I think it summarizes the whole experience of the film. And one particular plot spoiler that I do want to discuss, because it does really bother me, and I don't understand for the life of me why they did this, in terms of Barry going back into time to save his mother, and then realizing that that was a horrible mistake, and then he has to try and fix that and undo his own actions, which he does. But in the present, his father has been on trial for the murder of his mother and falsely accused. And so instead of trying to prove his father's innocence by, essentially working more in the Batman mold, and since Barry is a criminologist, you would think that he would be trying to overturn his father's conviction and prove his innocence in the legal system. Well, essentially, we don't see it, but Barry did actually alter time once again to exonerate his father, and it ultimately means that the whole film was pointless, because if the point of the film was Barry Allen having to learn to deal with his past and that he couldn't change time, and changing time back to how it had gone, he then changed time again. So it's like, I don't understand why that was done, other than to very easily get Barry off the hook for otherwise not caring about his dad basically, going to be convicted of killing his mother and having to just fix his own problems for the whole film, and then suddenly realizing, oh yeah, we forgot about that. Well, he just changed time again. It's fine. And then to have a sort of slightly skewed future then, and a sort of jokey Back to the Future ending. And of course, Back to the Future is referenced in this film many times, and it's really overdone. But I guess that was their attempt at showing what they were trying to pull from a lot. So I think that's the film's greatest single problem, especially from a story and storytelling and plot perspective, that essentially at the very end they go against their entire story meaning by saying, oh yeah, well, he just changed time again and everything was fine, except it was slightly different. Why did we sit through the whole film that came before that? So ultimately, I feel like this Flash film is very much a hot mess that it still plays fine on the surface, so I think most people will come away having, a relatively decent time, but it's not something that's going to stick with you because the plot never really fully gels in terms of really building and maintaining its effectiveness. It doesn't have a good story focus, and anytime you're shoving a superhero film into one of these famous comic arcs and playing around with it when you don't have a pre-existing film to tell the hero's story first to set him up, you can't cram essentially 2 films worth of material into a single narrative without really having to work hard at trying to balance things, and it doesn't really do that. And it's this factor combined with the really poor effects work and the very terribly inconsistent tone and the humor that's undercutting all the dramatics going on throughout the whole film that those are the major sticking points for me. And then if you want to add in the quibbles about the multiverse scene and my definite quibbles about some of the things they give Bruce Wayne to do and how that doesn't really seem like even Keaton's Bruce Wayne, then again, it's a hot mess in a lot of ways. It's not, again, a bad film, but you're definitely going to have to see it just for specific reasons. And for most of us, it is simply because of Michael Keaton's presence. That's why we're all going to this, and Warner counted on this. And apparently, not enough of us have gone in terms of the ones they expected, and the film has already been deemed a financial failure for not hitting the weekend threshold that they were hoping for. Now, on a technical note, I did see this film in a Dolby Cinema location, which for digital cinema in major nationwide theaters is still, I think, the best technical presentation because you're getting dual 4K projection, you're getting Dolby Vision HDR, and you're getting a full Dolby Atmos setup. Now, not all Dolby Cinemas are built the same. They're mostly retrofitted into AMC theater locations, and I saw this film in a newly retrofitted hall, which is a little bit different, a little bit smaller than the other one I've been to a couple times. So in terms of the presentation, the visuals are, you're getting the dual 4K projection and Dolby Vision, so it is better than the digital IMAX experience in that regard. However, this is in a scope ratio, and the film was composed for the 1.90 to 1 ratio of digital IMAX. What this means is, even in Dolby Cinema, I noticed some moments where there were definitely some heads being chopped off at the top of the frame. So unfortunately, the scope reframing and reformatting of this, even though it shouldn't be too terribly different, it wasn't always done very well. And there are several instances, if you notice things like this, where it's primarily along the top. It seems like the top was a little tight in a lot of places, but there are definitely a lot of foreheads being cut off, a lot of tight close-ups that were not shot and composed that way, and you can really tell. So ultimately, the film does look a little tight. So if you want to see the film presented in its original aspect ratio and avoid some heads getting chopped off, you will have to go see it in an IMAX venue. But again, you will lose the dual 4K projection, Dolby Vision HDR, and Dolby Atmos, which is the real highlights of Dolby Cinema and why it is the best current presentation for digital cinema releases in standard theaters nationwide. Now, in terms of the sound mix itself and the Atmos presentation, there was really only one moment that had a nice sound design to it in terms of the Atmos mix. And that's one moment where in the upgraded version of the Batwing, it has the spinnable canopy where the actual seats inside can do the 360-degree spin like they're on an internal, obviously they can spin around like a lot of modern planes can do the same thing. So when that sequence happens a few times, and there's one where there's a guy clinging on the outside of the Batwing, and Batman does this several times. There are some nice sound pans which do have nice overhead movements in Atmos, and because it's facing towards the screen instead of filling the auditorium, it's a nice particular effect that is something that is much more optimized to having Atmos in the overhead channels. But outside of that, that was really the only notable moment for me in terms of the sound design that had something unique and nice and striking to it. This was was a bit boomy. In Dolby Cinema, they're trying, I think, to follow some of the IMAX sound trends. So the low end was a bit boomy and the highs were a bit loud, and there seemed to be a lack of the mid range, at least where I saw it. So I don't know if it's because that theater's just configured differently, but it definitely seemed like to be part of the mix itself, and a lot of the stuff is in most modern film mixes. So while I would recommend people to just go ahead and see every film they can in Dolby Cinema, I know it is more expensive and it is a premium ticket price. So with the effects of this film not being very good and the sound mix only being, I didn't think the sound mix was very good either, and there only being really one moment that shined in Atmos for about 30 seconds. I think this is a film where if you really don't care about optimal quality for this particular film, if you see it in a standard theater, I don't think you're going to be missing very much. So in conclusion, I do think the Flash film is a bit of a hot mess. It was actually better than I expected, because I went in just not expecting anything. I'm not a fan of what Warner has done with their DC characters in the films they've been making, and I kind of checked out after Man of Steel, but I know those films have a great fan base, and that's perfectly fine. But I know there are a lot of others who are coming to this film simply because of the return of Michael Keaton. The problem is they shoved him into a Flash film, and we go in and we get invested in what Keaton's doing, and we want more of Batman, but this is actually a Flash story, and it's shoved into a version of Flashpoint. So whether you're invested in the Flash story, you're invested in what Batman's doing, or you're invested in the Flashpoint story version that's being told, it's a film that's subdivided among itself. So whatever you're following, you're probably going to get jerked out of it to then have to deal with the other characters or the other story elements, which again, I think goes back to the film's greatest problem, which is the script has a definite lack of focus. And because you're shoving in a Flash film into a version of Flashpoint without a previous Flash film to establish these materials, and you're having a great focus on a returning iteration of Batman, it's a film that's subdividing itself and subdividing its focus. And then we go into a chunk of Man of Steel. So it's a hard thing to pull off. I don't think the film does a very good job of it. However, it's still a decent enough experience. And for those who just have always wanted to see more of Michael Keaton on screen as Bruce Wayne and in the Batsuit as Batman, you're going to get that at least. But there are definitely some moments where it feels like it's just Michael Keaton's been dropped into this thing, and if they had chosen any other iteration, the film would have been fine. It does lose a lot of gravitas from the original Flashpoint story arc, so outside of Keaton's presence, I can't really recommend anything else in this film, to be honest. There's literally nothing else to write home about it outside of the fact that Keaton's here. So to be honest, if you want a more effective version of this story, the Flashpoint Paradox that is part of the DC Animated Universe series of films, it's just over 80 minutes, so it's an abridged version of the original comic arc, but it does maintain and actually enhance some of the darkness in that story. It's a very grim tale, and it does have the gravitas, because it is focused. So while I do think it does skim over some things and abbreviate things a bit too much because it's just over 80 minutes compared to the original comic, I think it is still extremely effective. And again, it has that gravitas. It does invest you in things, and it's not going for the nostalgia overload in terms of having Keaton in the film. So there's actually less distractions, and the story focus is maintained. And also, it's only 82 minutes, so they don't have time to play with anything else. So I do actually think the animated film is a better story and a better told story, and of course is rooted in the original comic. And for a more befitting Michael Keaton Batman adventure, we have the Batman 89 comic. I mean, it's just, they even use Keaton's likeness, and you have the original writer Sam Hamm, who wrote Batman 89 before it was slightly rewritten by Warren Scarron, writing his Batman that he co-developed with Tim Burton on the original film. Again, this has more of the Keaton Batman in it than Michael Keaton actually being in the film because he's just sort of dropped in there. He's perfectly on point throughout, but there are some things they give him to do that just don't feel necessarily like that's what his Batman from the Tim Burton films would do. It does feel a little out of place, although he himself grounds it in his characterization. It's not a fault of the performance, it's more of the script using him. It's like trying to put a square in a round hole. Essentially, it doesn't quite fit and it doesn't quite gel. And when you read the Batman '89 comic, there is none of that, and you can actually picture and hear and imagine Keaton doing these scenes. This is essentially a natural growth from the two Burton films into a third film we never got that is more in line with the more story-focused '89 original film with more of the darker tone that was in Sam Hamm's original drafts before Warren Scarron came in. So this is a real love letter to fans and the Keaton Batman and the Tim Burton films. You do get some of that in the Flash film, but it just feels a little bit impure in places, and it's really more Keaton's performance that grounds it, and that's why you're invested, not necessarily what they're giving him to do. So if you want a pure Michael Keaton Batman experience that is new, and you're just dying for that, and you haven't read the Batman '89 comic yet, please go check it out. It's in this very lovely hardcover trade edition. It's very inexpensive. It's usually about $20 or less, so I'd very highly recommend that. Or if this film got you back into your Keaton Batman fandom, or you're looking for something else because you're just so back in the want to get nuts mode, check out the Batman '89 comic. So those are my thoughts on the new Flash film, really the thoughts of a Batman fanatic, not much of a Flash fanatic, with more, I just have a more passing interest in the Speedster. But, this was an interesting film. It's a film I think people are going to look at for a long time and try and pick apart and study. But it does sort of represent the last sort of gasp of the existing DC Universe films. And I think after this and the deemed financial failure of the opening weekend, they're just going to try and move on with their new universe plans and not really have any holdovers from this series of films, which I think they will very much tie off to the previous heads of the Warner Company and previous corporate regimes, which is pretty much standard practice in Hollywood. So for those who have seen the film or who are curious, I hope this has been at least somewhat helpful and informative, just to hear my general thoughts and opinions. Again, these are merely my opinions and my own takeaways from the film. You may not agree with them, but if you have any comments, I would love to continue the discussion below. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. How many more Keaton Batman adventures do we want? Do we really need? What, 6? 6? 6? Yeah, 6 is good.